Cardamom and brown sugar warmed the air as I slid the last tray from the oven and set it on the narrow sill outside my kitchen window. The December light had thinned to pewter the marine layer, riding in on a mild wind that made the curtains breathe. I had planned carefully, stubbornly, for a quiet evening, a cup of coffee, a plate of cookies cooling on plates that didn't match a holiday station mumbling through an old radio with a loose dial. The phone rang. It was the steady, deliberate ring of a landline that I kept out of habit and contrariness. I wiped my hands on a dish towel speckled with cinnamon and lifted the receiver. "Hi, Mom." Lila's voice arrived with the composure of someone who'd rehearsed in the car. She always sounded as though she'd set her tone with a level. "We're keeping Christmas simple this year," she said. "Just Evan's parents and sisters. You know how they are about numbers. It's easier if we do a smaller thing." The words landed as if they were administrative forms, filed boxes ticked. Her phrasing was unruffled, even kind, as though it were a common-sense solution we'd both reached days ago. There was no malice in it, only the convenience of a conclusion already drawn. I didn't move. Through the open window, I could hear the faint rattle of the flagpole rope on the building across from mine. Someone downstairs laughed a short burst, and a car door shut. I pressed the receiver a little closer to my ear and let the space lengthen until I felt more than hurt her expectation that I would fill it with apologies, with compromises, with the gentle work of making myself smaller. "That sounds lovely," I said. "Enjoy." Silence took a half step backward. "Oh," she said. Not alarm, just surprise at the absence of the usual negotiations. "Well, yes. Okay then, we'll talk soon." "Will? We will." I replaced the receiver in its cradle. The dial tone returned for a breath and cut off. Steam from the open oven door slid across my knuckles. I turned the oven off, nudged the trays closer together, and poured coffee into a chip mug that had outlived 2 apartments. On the table between a salt cellar and a chip saucer lay a small indigo suede pouch. I had placed it there earlier without quite admitting why. The weight of it had been a private gravity since Tuesday. I untied the drawstring. Brass keys spilled into my palm with a polite clinking, each one stamped with numbers I had already memorized. Their coolness surprised me. I'd fetched them from the safety box that sat ridiculous, perhaps, in the flower bin, a little vault padded with paper towels. Escrow had closed 3 days ago. When the title company emailed, I didn't open the attachment right away. I watched the ocean from the bluff first and counted pelicans sliding past the cliff face. I let the fact of it sink, then I let the numbers follow. The cliffside house on Cypress Point was mine, paid for. Not in installments or with the wobble of a loan, but in one clean ledger line that crumpled the distance between a life lived carefully and a solitary promise finally kept. I set the keys back in the pouch and wrapped both hands around the mug. The window glass fogged, then cleared, fogged again. The smell of spice and butter went heavy, and behind it the memory of my husband shaped itself with the offhand precision he had loved. David never gave speeches about money. He preferred charts drawn on the backs of junk mail envelopes, compound interest penciled in tidy slopes that looked like hills on a childhood map. In the late 90s, he started buying shares while our friends were busy trading rumors and dot-com slogans. He liked cheap funds and companies that made parts other companies needed, the quiet engines under prettier logos. "We'll be wrong for a while," he'd say, "until we're right for a very long time." After he died, I let his selections sit. I couldn't bear to touch them, and not touching became its own form of discipline. Dividends arrived as if the envelopes had learned our doorway by heart. I filed the notices the way he would have, chronologically, then alphabetically within the year. Time did the elementary work that patience demands. What had looked for years like modest hills on paper shifted to something closer to a range. There was also the acreage. It came to me from my Aunt Rosa, along with 2 quilt tops, a tin of buttons, and a boxy photograph of a mule staked in shallow shade. The land sat out in the dry shoulder of the county, more dust than field, bordered by a fence that forgot itself in 3 places. In summer, it was a chorus of heat and grasshoppers. In winter, it was the kind of brown that swallowed your shoes. Our neighbor said it was not quite nothing. It was less than nothing, with property taxes attached. Rosa had maintained a stoic fantasy about citrus. The groundwater had other ideas. So the parcel waited, and I paid those small bills and kept a file labeled "Rosa's ground do not sell," because compulsion masquerading as faith sometimes finds its footing. Then the county lines shifted on a map nobody asked my opinion about. The planners began to talk about corridors and setbacks and mixed use. A sign went up on the highway promising a turn lane that never seemed to arrive. Survey trucks appeared and disappeared. The calls began. I told the first 2 offers no out of respect for my own ignorance. I said maybe to the 3rd. By the 5th, I had numbers I could write on David's Hill. When a developer with a tidy ponytail offered terms that made even my accountant remove his glasses and polish them twice, I asked for a weekend. I walked the fence that misplaced itself and touched the brittle weeds and said thank you to a woman who had kept a mason jar full of nickels behind her stove. On Sunday night I signed. I rolled the proceeds into a like-kind exchange as the law permits, into a house with sea glass in its foundation and salt in its paint. None of this would have looked like wealth from the curb of my building. I used coupons the way other people cross themselves out of habit and comfort. I drove a sedan old enough to have earned a name. When Lila insisted on giving me envelopes for extra groceries, I accepted them. I didn't need her money, but I wanted to know who my daughter was when she believed I did. At dusk, I tied off the trash bag and carried it down the stairwell that leaned slightly to the left. The hallway smelled of laundry detergent and someone's overambitious cinnamon candles. Ms. Patel from the second floor was waiting near the mailboxes in a coat the color of plums. She held up her phone. "Are you all right?" she asked, not nosy, simply exact. On the screen, a group text bloomed, Leela plus Evan plus family. A message from my daughter sat at the top like a headline. "Mom canceled on us," she had typed. "She says she wants a quiet night this year." I had the bright, silly impulse to explain myself to a phone I didn't own. The lie had a practical shape, trimming embarrassment into a story with clean edges. It wasn't enough to leave me off the guest list. She had to narrate my absence as choice. Erasure works best when it sounds agreeable. "Thank you," I told Miss Patel. She put her hand on my sleeve for a heartbeat and then let me go. In my apartment, I smoothed the dish towel on the back of a chair and returned to the table. The keys had made a dark crescent on the suede. I slipped them back into the pouch and pulled the drawstring tight. I did not pace. I did not write a letter I would never send. I cut a cookie and tasted the edge where the sugar had caramelized to a shy crisp. Then I washed the mug and set it upside down on the rack because some actions protect their dignity by being small. In bed, the ocean's static threaded through the open window and the radiator pinged to remind me that small rooms have their own constellations. I slept as if someone had opened a door in a crowded hallway. Morning brought a cold that made the street signs blink. I packed a thermos and a paper sack, bread tangerines, a heel of cheese, and put the suede pouch at the top of my tote. The car started on the third try, a familiar negotiation. The freeway was kind to the early hour, and the coastline curved as though it had been drawn by a patient hand. Gulls kited over the bluff. A pair of cyclists in matching jackets leaned into the grade and rode out of the frame. I turned off at a ramp that still smelled faintly of asphalt and followed a narrow lane that pretended for a few yards to be private. The gate stood simple and black against a stand of cypress. I pressed the remote and its arms parted without argument. I stopped before I crossed the threshold. The house rose from the bluff as if the cliff had translated itself into angles and glass, 2 stories of light and shadow with a terrace that caught the morning and sent it back softer. I didn't get out right away. The sea made its ordinary vow at the base of the cliff. The breeze found the crack in my window and traced my knuckles, and I let the engine idle another second for gratitude's sake. I wasn't late for anything. I had come to unlock a door I had already opened in every way that mattered. When I finally stepped out, the ground felt sure beneath me. I shut the car door gently so it wouldn't echo. The keys weighed familiar in my pocket, not heavy but deliberate. I stood for a long breath on the gravel and watched a long swell shoulder itself against the point. Then I walked toward the gate, the suede pouch against my palm, my other hand tucked into my coat for warmth, not hesitation. I didn't think a word that would sound like ceremony. I simply reached for the latch. The latch lifted with a simple weight of the wrist. Gravel shifted under my shoes, and the sound was precise in the morning air as if the house were listening. Wind combed through the cypress and threaded the eaves with a low hum. I crossed the threshold and stepped into the sheltered court where a narrow strip of shade kept the stucco cool. Salt rode the light like a second skin. Inside, the entry opened to a room that behaved like a tide pool glass on 2 sides, pale floors, a ceiling that arched and let the eye climb. I set my tote on a bench built from an old pier plank and stood still long enough to hear the house breathe the compressor, settling the slight strain of glass in a mild gust, the steady tick of a clock somewhere I hadn't placed yet. It sounded exactly like an empty instrument waiting for the first note. I turned left into the kitchen. Brass rails caught the light like quiet punctuation. I set the thermos by the sink and pulled the suede pouch from my bag. The keys made their small formal sound against the stone counter. I didn't scatter them. I lined them up the way David would have 1, 2, 3 shank to shoulder, as if that kind of order could steady everything else. A woman's voice drifted from the great room. "You're early, which is my favorite kind of guest." She appeared from behind a ladder tablet under one arm, pencil tucked behind her ear, a habit I've always trusted in other people. "Marin," she said, offering her hand with an easy competence. "We spoke about the trees." "We did." She moved with the convenience of someone who had already mapped the room. 12-foot fir here," she said, pointing toward the arch of the ceiling where light pooled and softened. "Not grandiose, just tall enough to teach the eye how high this is." On the terrace, the tables will want to line up perpendicular to the rail, not parallel. That way the sea reads as a backdrop, not a distraction. Show me. We walked to the glass. The terrace ran the width of the house, wrapping one shallow step down to a second platform. Marin stood at the threshold and held the tablet up like a placard. 4 tables on the main span, 2 on the lower, leaving a clean path for movement. If we hang the lights along the arches and pin the garlands to the outer rail, you'll get the long view without a tangle. I don't want a tangle, I said, surprised at how certain the sentence felt in my mouth. She glanced sideways with a half smile as if I'd given her more than an aesthetic preference, and then started in on the placement of candles big enough to have their own weather. I left her to the geometry and walked the length of the room. In the study, morning stacked itself in layers on the oak table. My folio lay where I'd set it during the inspection, a leather book with more gravity than its papers would suggest. I opened the top drawer and found what I hoped for, a small wooden box, the kind that snaps with a shy sound. I lifted the lid. The pearls lay coiled like a low moon. My mother's wedding strand, rescued, repaired, rarely worn. I didn't put them on. I took them in my palm and felt their cool debate with my skin, as if they were doing the thinking I didn't intend to do out loud. When I stepped back into the great room, Marin was measuring the span with the tape hooked in her teeth. "You'll have company?" she asked, conversational, no pry. "Yes." "Good," she said, as if that fact squared with her plans for the garland. "This house likes people." After she left to pick up lights from a rental place the next town over, I sat at the edge of the terrace where the sun caught the tips of the waves and made them look newly minted. The cove below sighed in its patient way. I took out my phone and scrolled to a number I hadn't used in months. "Vera," I said when she answered, the old valley in her voice arriving before the words. "Well now," she said, surprise warming instantly into amusement. "I thought you'd forgotten we were the same age." "I haven't forgotten anything that matters. Are you busy tonight?" There was the flit of papers, the rustle of a pencil finding a page. "After what Lila said last year, I didn't think." "Don't think about last year." A short breath. "Do you want me to bring anything?" "Just yourself." I could picture her looking around her kitchen in Sacramento, the magneted coupons on the fridge. She never used the apron with flour in the same place every time. She cleared her throat. "I'll be driving as if the road were made for me." When we hung up, I called Marco. He answered from a garage with a radio playing something bright and old. I could hear the rattle of a socket, the patient conversation of metal in hand. "Cousin," he said, "you finally moving to civilization. I moved to the edge of it. Come tonight." He laughed, and the sound carried the same shape as it had when we were children. "Lila told us you wanted to be alone these days." She was misinformed. "I like that word," he said, savoring it. "I'll bring bread." "Bring a story," I said, and he made a contented noise. I hadn't heard from him since his wife died and left a gap. You had to walk around. The calls multiplied the way good things do when you let them. I tapped the names I knew, and then the ones I only suspected might still be glad to see me. There were the church women who had a key to every casserole dish in the county. There was Mr. and Mrs. Ortiz from 2 doors down. In my old building, their youngest son had taught me how to coax my radiator into compliance with a spoon and a soft curse. There was Celine, who ran a youth arts program out of a brick building with windows that caught sunset like a habit. "You always send a check without a return address," Celine said when she picked up. "You're my favorite ghost." "Don't call me that. Bring your quartet, the big kids." "They'll be nervous," she said, "but the kind of nervous that turns into music." "Let them be nervous here, then." I wrote the names on a pad because writing steadies the hand that makes a list. After the 10th call, I stopped counting, not out of carelessness, but because the counting was doing the wrong kind of work. I put my phone face down and went to the kitchen to boil water in a pot big enough to qualify as furniture. By noon, the driveway filled with the small choreography of vans and hatchbacks. A caterer named Emilio arrived with crates that sweated in the sun, paper-wrapped salmon, spiny crab, looking like an exclamation, boxes of lemons that smelled like clean rooms. He had a crew of 3 and a plan that fit in his head the way a map fits a city. He took my stove's measure and nodded as if we'd agreed on something. "You cook?" he asked politely. I remember how I said. "Then you can taste," he replied, already in his element. Marin returned with the lights, a spool of greenery, and a willingness to climb. She worked the ladder with the fluency of someone who had learned to trust her own foot. The garland settled against the arch with a satisfying give. As she looped the last strand, she called down, "Do you want red anywhere?" "No red," I said, surprising myself once more with the firmness of it. Green-white breath sea. "Sea isn't a color," she said, stepping down to judge her work. "Isn't it?" She considered the water and conceded the point. In the bedroom, I opened the wardrobe that still smelled faintly of cedar. I ironed a dress that had outlived fashion by deciding not to recognize it. On the bed, I laid out a shawl I hadn't worn in years. It had the sort of weave that looks like logic made visible. I lifted the small wooden box again, and this time the pearl settled precisely in the place where my collarbone makes its own quiet idea of symmetry. I didn't study myself in the mirror. I looked long enough to make sure a stranger wouldn't be startled, and then returned to the room that needed setting. In the middle of this, my phone buzzed with the insistence of a question. A text from a neighbor in my old building arrived, a screenshot clipped from a thread with a name that kept its relations neat. Lila plus Evan plus family. Keeping it small this year, Lila had typed. Mom prefers her movies and tea. I read it once. It was efficient, which I recognized as a kind of skill. I set the phone face down again and finished tying a ribbon around a pot of paper whites with the kind of careful attention red usually demands. Marin watched me from the arch with her hands braced on her hips. She didn't ask, I didn't say. She tightened the final screw on a clip and stepped back. By late afternoon, the light had turned the sea to hammered metal. The first car eased through the gate and rested in a respectful line at the curve. I went to the door with the peculiar calm of a person who has seen the before and the after and is tasked only with the during. Vera was first wrapped in a coat that had opinions about winter. Her hair had committed to gray without surrender. When I opened my arms, she dropped her purse as if objects were an offense and hugged me with the certainty of a person who knows where the ribs are. You are not a ghost, she said into my shoulder. I am not, I said, and the floor justified itself under our feet. Marco arrived next, smelling like engine grease and eucalyptus soap. He brought bread stacked in a crate as if it were newly translated. He put his hand on the doorframe and admired the joinery. Somebody measured twice, he said, which is how he prays. The house learned its guests quickly. Coats found the backs of chairs they liked. Voices made low decisions about where to gather. On the terrace, Marin's lights came alive in a soft sequence, the filament warming from metallic to a slow, hospitable sun. Emilio's crew moved through the kitchen with a choreography that didn't need music. Steam rose in consensus from the big pots, and the scent of dill decided to live here for an hour. Celine arrived with 4 teenagers carrying cases too long to hide. They stood near the rail and tuned in a hush that wasn't timid. It was the kind of quiet a room earns by listening correctly. When they began the first violin, found a note so clean the sea held its breath for it. People turned instinctively toward the sound and then politely back to their conversations as if not to embarrass beauty by noticing it directly. I stood at the edge of the terrace, where the stone remembers the sun long after it leaves. The tables filled without arrangement. Church women beside the Ortiz boy, who once repaired my radiator, Vera, across from a neighbor of Marine's, who had come to deliver eucalyptus and stayed to ask about the lights. Marco tapped his glass lightly with the back of his knife and told a story about a birthday I'd forgotten on the calendar but remembered in the cake, and the room made a soft noise that registers as weather in certain countries and comfort in others. Listen, he said, and then he didn't tell them to. They listened anyway. When the first platters went out, they traveled arm to arm the way care does when it isn't announced. I took a plate to a woman I didn't know who had arrived with someone whose name I didn't catch, and she thanked me with a tilt of her head that made me want to place her face on a shelf where I keep things I'd like to recognize later. Someone bumped my elbow gently and slid a flute into my hand. It was the cheap sparkling wine I like, not a compromise of preference. I lifted it not high just to make sure it could see. The quartet shifted to something with a winter spine. The horizon made its customary decision without asking. As the sun stepped down, the sea took the light, and nobody filed a complaint. I pulled my phone from my pocket. The glass reflected the terrace lights and then yielded to the camera's sincerity. In the frame, people leaned toward one another, and their faces had the kind of animation you cannot fake because it doesn't know there is an audience. The ornaments on the fur in the great room found their own language in the glass doors, a private shimmer that translated as enough. I took the photo and posted it without adjusting for better light or clever angles. The caption did not audition for anything. Celebrating with the family who chose me. The screen dimmed and then woke as if surprised to be included. A heart appeared, then a line of words that belonged to a friend I hadn't seen in 15 years. Then another from an uncle who collects stamps with the fervor of a convert. Names I knew and names I thought I'd lost came forward with their small handshakes. Looks good, proud of you. Wish I were there next time I'm bringing pie. The tide of it moved without hurry and without warning. I let it run. I didn't stand apart to watch. I stood inside it with my back against the rail and the smell of lemon on my hand. Your house approves, Marine, said, appearing at my shoulder with a loop of extra ribbon. It's making a note of everyone who came. Houses don't keep ledgers. This one might, she said, and went to rescue a candle from a draft. Emilio handed me a fork and a sliver of salmon, testing the heat with the back of his wrist, as if the food had a temperature it preferred to be praised at. I tasted it, nodded, and he moved on peaceful in the knowledge that something had landed where it should. The quartet shifted again, and the second violin found a low run that threaded through the talk like twine. The first stars came out in the slice of sky between the cypress domestic as kitchen pins. I slipped the phone into my pocket, the pearls cool against my throat, and took a breath that felt correctly measured for the space it occupied. Somewhere close by, a phone rang, with the particular insistence of a call that expects compliance. Mine, not someone else's. The sound sketched a bright line on the linen where I'd said it without thinking. The name on the screen belonged to my daughter. The device buzzed once against the table's grain, then again steady as a clock. I turned the glass on its side to keep it from catching the light and let the ring finish speaking for itself. The sea continued its ordinary conversation with the cliff. A teenager near the rail missed a note, recovered, and smiled into her instrument as if it had told her a joke. I set the phone down face to the wood and reached for the platter nearest my hand. The room did not demand a decision. It offered a seat. I took it. The phone kept pulsing against the wood in a rhythm that had nothing to do with music. I let it finish and for a moment pretended the vibration belonged to the table, the glass, the spoons finding their way back to their places. Then I turned it over. Missed call, Lila. Another. Then a third that had grown a little red dot beside it, voicemail. I didn't step away from the table as if privacy could be engineered with distance. I stayed where I was and lifted the phone to my ear with my back to the rail. Celine's students were working through a carol that asks the ear for patience before it gives the shape of itself. The sea kept time without asking permission. The first message was brisk, the voice of a woman who never leaves a field blank on a form. Mom, call me back. The second had the same sentence, the same evenly measured tones, only shorter, as if the space for courtesy had tightened in the span between calls. The third was not Lila. A small voice filled the speaker, clipped slightly by a room with a television in it and a ceiling fan that made a soft mechanical confessing. Grandma, is the show on? Are we watching the fireworks together? Noah. Evan must have given him the phone like a prop. Say hello. Try again. He was 6 now, taller than his age, in photographs, with a cowlick that refused discipline and a seriousness about Lego assemblies that could have led a meeting. He had spent last winter with a cough that hadn't frightened the doctors but had terrified me anyway. We used to watch the New Year show in the same chair, his feet tucked parallel to mine, each set of toes, reporting from a different country. I made popcorn, he said into the audio air. Mom says you're busy. Okay, that's okay. The message ended blindly polite. I let the phone rest against my chest until it warmed. The room near me went on being a room, voices, plates of spoon ringing the side of a pot. I set the phone down and found Celine at the rail. They sound good, I said, and discovered my voice knew the difference between the truth and a way to keep a conversation brave. They're finding each other, she said. That's most of what music asks. Do they take requests? She lifted a shoulder. They take suggestions that pretend to be requests, then suggest what suits this room best. Already did. She crinkled her eyes and moved to speak to her cellist, who had the shyness of someone handsome enough to distrust the economy of attention. I took another step into the terrace glass in one hand and the disobedient ache in the other. I didn't perform a deliberation. I stood still while the ache found a place to sit down. Then I lifted my glass just enough to be counted by the nearest faces. If you have a bite in your mouth, keep it, I said, and they smiled because that is the kind of permission adults appreciate. I'm grateful you came, no more than that. Gratitude can do its own work without flourishes. Marco, not interested in ceremony, tapped his fork once. Anyway, gentle as a metronome. Hear, hear, he said, and didn't try to make it fancy. The quartet's lines braided under the low talk. The garlands found their scent. Emilio slid past with a platter balanced on one arm, calm in the weather he had invented. The phone lit again, the screen stuttering with Lila's name. I left it face down. A child at the far table negotiated a crab leg with the focus that makes the world a manageable size. Vera caught my eye and held it, not intrusive, not avoiding what she knew, merely acknowledging the room had more than one conversation running in it, and that both belonged to me. We made it through the first course, then the second. The light in the glass doors shifted from interior to mirror as the sea replaced the sky with itself. I carried a basket of bread to the lower platform and set it near a chair where nobody was sitting, because someone would be soon. When I straightened headlights, traveled the curve of the drive, and landed square on the iron gate, white coins thrown against black wire. Conversation thinned the way a tide curls back from a rock, low, certain with a small hiss where it leaves. I didn't watch the line of cars the way a person watches weather. It was one SUV, then the soft slam of doors. Celine's first violin glanced at me and kept her bow moving because she had learned to keep her hands ahead of her fear. Emilio lifted a lid and replaced it, as if a pot could be persuaded to remain part of the evening's manners. I set the bread down and walked toward the house. The foyer gathered the outside with a draft and presented it on the marble as a chill that didn't apologize for itself. The knock was decisive without being loud. When I opened the door, the cypress shed a few dry needles onto the threshold, quick as punctuation. Lila, first coat belted too tightly, posture held as if it had been ironed. Behind her, Evan, whose shoulders knew how to take a message sooner than the rest of him. He smelled faintly of cologne that tries to be a kind of evidence. Their silhouettes broke apart as the light found them. "You've been ignoring our calls," she said, greeting and reprimand braided into one ribbon. "I've been hosting," I said with no slope in my voice either direction. She took in the arch, the glow beyond glass, the long table with its slow geography of plates. For a second her mouth opened in a child's way as if a question might escape without passing through a thought, and then the expression closed itself to something tidier. "We were worried," Evan added as if honest concern had been their first instrument and not the third. I leaned a palm briefly against the door, then stepped aside. "Come in." They crossed the threshold and halted in that deliberate way married people have when one is looking to the other for terms. The chandelier showed them their own faces in small bright ellipses. From the terrace came a burst of laughter shaped like the scrape of a chair. "In here," I said and led them to the study. The room received us with the composure of wood and paper. The leather folio lay where I had left it, the corner aligned with the grain, as if it could please the table into performing a virtue. I opened the folio and slid one document forward without the flourish of a reveal. The title sat clean at the top, the name set as unambiguously as words allow themselves to be set. Deed. Owner me. Lila didn't reach for it. She read from where she stood as if proximity would be an admission. When she spoke, the sentence had the sound of a gasp that had been taught manners. "You bought a house on the bluff." "I did." "How?" The word carried several passengers' accusation, bewilderment, a tiny seed of awe that hadn't purchased its ticket yet. "Slowly," I said. And then all at once, which is how slow looks from across the room. Evan looked at the corner of the paper as if a number might declare an amnesty. "You told us you were fine." He paused because the next word would have to commit to a version of history, and that is strenuous work. "I let you believe what you preferred to believe," I said. "There's a distinction." Lila's chin rose a fraction, that old calculus registering if I elevate my gaze, I don't have to adjust my understanding. "We thought you needed help. You gave me envelopes labeled for groceries. I didn't move my hands. I cashed some of them. I bought butter. I kept the receipts in a tin because keeping things is a habit that has kept me. And you never said," "I never said that my husband bought what he believed in and kept it long enough for his faith to look like foresight. I never said that Aunt Rosa's useless rectangle of earth learned a new language when the planners drew a different map, and that usefulness, once it knows it has a body, hurries. I never said that there are exchanges the law allows if you learn to speak within its exact grammar, and that I paid in full. I didn't say any of this because I didn't owe anyone the story of how I arranged my dignity." She blinked, and in that brief wet shudder, something unarranged showed itself. She reached for the edge of the desk, and then withdrew her hand as if the leather had heat. "Do you know what it's like?" she said. Voice trimmed but not steady to carry us into Evan's family with your coupons and your old car, and she exhaled. "They measure everything. They have a chart in their heads, and I was tired of being at the wrong end of it." Evan colored the flesh of a man who would prefer his private systems to remain proprietary. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, then let his hand fall, because there are gestures that have finished their work. I nodded once as if she had named the thing, and therefore made it subject to wait, and not only to speculation. "So the solution was to decide I had canceled a holiday I wasn't invited to," I said. "To make a story neat enough to carry in your pocket." Lila's mouth pressed into its own idea of a line. "That isn't fair." The group thread showed me the sentence, I said evenly. Fairness has a way of sounding like a complaint when you are asked to apply it to yourself. Silence arrived, not as a comfort, but as a ledger. Evan looked into it and found his name written there. "I should have asked you." He said words small and unpracticed. "When Lila stopped forwarding your texts, I should have..." He faltered. I didn't want to make it worse. "Peace," I said, "doesn't come from pretending the storm is a ceiling fan." I let that sit. "You don't have to explain, Evan. There are men who hold the coat at the door while someone else tells the lie inside the room. It's a position." I didn't say more because description can do its work without verdict. The quartet climbed a phrase in the next room and landed it. From here it sounded like a firm breath. "You could have told us," Lila said again, weakly protective of her thesis. "I could have. I chose not to. My reasons have names you might or might not respect, but we are not here to argue the preface." I closed the folio and then placed my palm on it, not to guard it, only to remind myself that paper has weight. "We are here because you are standing in a house you did not think I could own, and because that fact has introduced a draft into your ideas about me." She looked past me through the door toward the corridor of light. The noise of people arrived like proof. She swallowed, and I watched pride meet arithmetic. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't, listen." She did, if only because she had run out of other active verbs. I let the room hold her in that posture, half a minute, the generous length of a pause, when a person is beginning to understand they are not the main instrument. When I spoke, I didn't lift a finger to count. I have never liked the theater of fingers. "If you want a place at my table," I said, "there are conditions." I didn't soften the word. "First, we meet with someone with a license in a room with chairs designed for the human spine. All of us. not to take turns accusing but to learn aloud how to be decent, without needing to be right. She started to interrupt and then caught the gesture before it left her mouth. Second, a month in which you asked nothing of me, no errands disguised as love, no money disguised as pride, no advice disguised as interest. Only actions that demonstrate you understand the difference between help and control. And third, Evan asked, almost relieved to be given positions instead of atmospheres. An apology delivered where the injury was performed. You told relatives and friends that I had excused myself from my own life. You will return to those rooms and correct your account. She stared at me as if I had asked her to lift the house and put it gently back down a degree to the left. Her eyes shone in a way that would have tempted anyone who didn't know the cost of being tempted. I did not offer a tissue. I stood in the space I was already in. And Noah, she said in a voice that had traveled a long way to become a whisper, he asks about you. He thinks well, he thinks the world is arranged to be sensible. The trust is drafted, I said. His share waits in a drawer with the other papers, not because money is a prize for affection, but because I have to put it somewhere and drawers are real. He will have it when he becomes a person who puts his hands to work for someone smaller than himself. Hours he can describe without boasting. Decisions he can defend without trembling. You'll make him prove, not to me, to himself. The proof happens wherever it needs to be kept. I only need to be sure I'm not paying for a life that never learns to stand up and carry its own name correctly. A long breath moved through Evan. Some of the performance left his frame. A man was permitted to stand where a husband had been. And if we agree, Lila asked, each word requiring a small fee. Then you may knock, I said. That is all. She closed her eyes and opened them a little slower as if to negotiate with light. I am ashamed, she said finally, not in apology, yet only in inventory. When I looked at you in the coat you wouldn't throw away, I heard Evan's mother making that little sound she makes when she's defending a thought she'd rather not own, and she shook her head. I let that sound live in me. Then I fed it. It is a hungry animal, I said. It eats everything you are not careful to protect. The chandelier hummed on its own circuit. From the other room a spoon struck a glass and someone laughed too loudly to compensate. I did not offer reconciliation like a hot drink. I let the terms sit on the table like a pair of folded hands. Evan looked at Lila. Something undecorated passed between them, the kind of exchange people call respect when they are generous and surrender when they are not. I can do it, he said mostly to himself. Lila took a breath that insisted on being counted and nodded once, which is the fiercest movement some people ever make. I lifted the folio and slid it back into the drawer. The wood received it with a small, satisfied click. There are people on the terrace who have never been invited to a house that faced the sea, I said, and that was the closest I would come to an explanation. We walked back through the foyer. The night had set itself properly outside black with the particular shine coastal air carries when it has had a good day. The cypress moved just enough to prove they were alive. At the threshold to the great room I stopped. Lila paused beside me, and for a fraction of a second we were two women arriving at a door, not a mother and a daughter negotiating the ledger of their names. She looked out across the terrace and the long tables, the coils of light, the faces she didn't know arranged like a relief map of a place she had never cared to visit. Celine's students were beginning a new piece, one that approached its center by circling it with a patience the ear couldn't quite name. Marco was showing a teenager how to crack a shell without sending shrapnel into the yard. Vera was sifting through a basket for the one roll that had managed to hide. There was no speech to give. There was a room to enter. I stepped forward. The pearls lay against my throat like a promise that had learned how to keep itself. Marin passed behind us with a lighter, rescuing a guttering flame with the confidence of someone who has learned what fire prefers. Evan reached for a chair. Lila smoothed the edge of a napkin with a hand that wanted a task. I took my place at the table, not at the head, not in the middle, just where the seat offered itself. The sea addressed the cliff in its monotone. The music threaded the air. Bread went around. The room accepted the additional weight and did not list. My phone buzzed once more where I had left it beside the glass. I flipped it face down without reading the name and set my fingers lightly on the stem of the flute to keep it from tipping. A young violist missed her entry by half a beat, smiled at herself and came in on the next measure, as if the world had made an adjustment just for her. Dessert arrived like a low tide, quite deliberate, leaving more than it took. The quartet packed their cases with the familiar care of people who know how to thank a room without saying it. Coats found their owners. Goodbyes braided themselves at the door. When the last taillight slipped along the curve and the gate took back its shape, the house exhaled. I blew out the candles with the gentleness of someone waking a sleeper, then walked the terrace once, palm over the stone still warm where the sun had been. Marin coiled her extra ribbon, tucked it into her pocket, and lifted a hand from the steps. It held, she said, meaning the evening may be the garland. I nodded. Emilio stacked pans with the efficiency of clean arithmetic and left the kitchen as he'd found it, except better. When the door fell soft behind them, the sea took the conversation it had lent us and put it back where it keeps such things. I rinsed 2 glasses, set them upside down, and wiped a pale ring from the table with the heel of my hand. The pearls lay cool at my throat, not insisting on notice. Lila and Evan had taken their seats without asking where they belonged. They had eaten enough to remember what food can do when it is not performing. We had not discussed the terms again. The words were already on the table in a place no plate could cover. I slept in sheets that held the faintest salt window-cracked radiator stilled. When morning came, the sky was the blue a bruise learns on its way back to ordinary. I laced my shoes and walked the bluff path that keeps the cliff honest. Gulls worked the wind like old hands. Far out, a trawler moved with the unbearable patience of boats, and pelicans drew their neat cursive along the seam where light becomes water and then refuses to be anything else. Each step loosened the room that had formed in my chest the night before, the one with chairs and a table set for whatever arrives. I touched the cypress as I passed Resin Sharp and came back to the house by the lower path, where the ice plant has the stubborn pink that ignores weather reports. The gate recognized me without being told to. In the study, the oak table gathered the morning as if it were another kind of paper. I set out a thin folder and a pen that prefers pages to screens. The document wasn't grand. A charter rarely is. It named a supper by a name that would read easily aloud, Harbor Table, and it stated what it needed to state: once a month, elders from anywhere within a bus ride would eat here at this long table without price and with their names learned. I signed on the line that waits for a person to say yes to their own handwriting. The pen made the small, satisfying sound that means ink has found wood through a layer of cotton. I straightened the chairs in the dining room so their backs looked in the same direction. Plates nested in stacks with the quiet of stones. I left the candles unlit and set the matches where hands could find them without asking. On the terrace, the garland held its green against the rail. The sea performed its one job without complaint. I took a photo. Not a wide shot, not a portrait, just the table, the emptiness arranged, the door glass catching a sliver of horizon no one would notice unless they were looking for it. I posted it the way a person sets a place: my house, my rules, my family chosen and earned. The screen blinked awake again almost at once. A message from Lila arrived, a neat block of text, the punctuation careful. A screenshot followed a calendar square. On Tuesday, the word therapist, typed into the title line, time set, location neutral. No commentary. I looked at it until the white of the screen seemed to confess the work it takes to be plain. Another ping. Noah's picture came in crooked from a child's hand, proud of its own daring. Blue crayon had made the ocean a little taller than the cliff. A rectangle on the bluff had too many windows and a door bigger than proportion allows. In the corner, a stick figure with a necklace grinned a circle smile. Grandma's house by the water. The letters insisted, some marching, some dancing. A small son wore a face like it had just learned a joke. I pressed my thumb to the glass, then put the phone face down, not to hide, only to let paper and wood be the materials in the room. I set water to boil and stood at the window while the kettle learned to speak. The cypress bent once, then decided to be themselves again. On the kitchen wall, a narrow strip of cork held a handful of old keys I keep out of respect for locks that no longer exist. I added the new ring to the hook beside them, not as a trophy, simply where it belongs. Metal spoke to metal in the tidy language it knows. In the ledger I keep for groceries and guests, I wrote the names from last night as far as I could remember them, first and last, where I had them, descriptions where I didn't, woman with the careful laugh. Boy who respects tools, cellist with kind shoulders. I left space between lines for corrections, additions, the polite business of accuracy. Steam curled from this cup. I carried it to the terrace and sat where the stone keeps a memory of sun even in winter. I took a slow sip, the heat finding the place is cold always claims first. Below, the water folded itself according to rules older than everyone I know. The house made its patient sounds, a settling, a thread of current in the wall, an absent footfall echoing where no one walked. When the cup was empty, I set it down on the table I had already set for later and listened to how a room sounds when it is ready. The wind shifted and dropped a single cypress needle onto the wood like a mark in the margin. I left it there. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.